looking at the U.S. movement to establish a Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Commission. And I'm, I'm beyond excited for the panelists that are joining us today. And one of the things that I think we're going to be really exploring is, of course, the national movement to establish a Truth Commission in the United States. But also we're bringing in perspectives from the very kind of local level and kind of getting an understanding of what that effort looks like. So to that end, I actually want to turn things over to Dr. Charles Chavis, who's going to be moderating our discussion and our panel today. Dr. Chavis is an assistant professor of conflict analysis and resolution and history, and the director of the program for history, justice, and racial reconciliation at the Carter School at George Mason University. So I'm super excited. Dr. Chavis, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce our topic further and take it away from there. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to it.
Great. Thank you so much, Theo. And just to begin, I want to thank Alliance for Peace Building for welcoming us to their webinar in this important series. Today, as Theo mentioned, we're going to be discussing systemic racism and the movement of movements, as we call it, to establish the U.S. Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Commission. And with us today, we have a number of local activists and leaders who are doing amazing work throughout the country. And I'll go through and give brief bios regarding very brief bios and affiliations for some of the panelists that we have with us today. Again, as Theo mentioned, I'm Charles Chavis, the Director of African and African American Studies at George Mason University. I'm also a professor in the Carter School as well. And I'm also Vice Chair for the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and one of the founding co-chairs of the U.S. Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation Movement. I have three guests who I personally want to welcome. James Yamakawa of Salisbury, Maryland, who represents the Wacomico County Truth and Reconciliation Initiative, as well as local activist Amber Green, president and founder of Phoenix Youth Project in Salisbury, Maryland. And also a good friend of mine, a colleague, and the chair for the nation's first Truth and Reconciliation Commission devoted to confronting the legacy of racial terror and racial lynching in the United States, Dr. David Fakunle, who is joining us, and also someone who I most recently have met and learned more about her work, Ms. Angela Waters Austin of One Love Global out of Michigan. Thank you all for joining us. And I just want to briefly lay the foundation, if I can, specifically in regards to why I believe that it's important for America to begin to have a timely conversation, a long overdue conversation, specifically about the ways in which we have to confront our systemic issues around race, right? And when we talk about systemic racism, it's important for us to understand we see it manifest specifically in the outcomes, right? And when people oftentimes discuss what it looks like, what a Truth Commission in the United States looks like, it's important for us to understand that we have to deal with and wrestle with the ways in which our country, the United States, was conceived in racism, anti-Black racism, sexism, and various forms of oppression, right? Someone is asking me to speak louder. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So we have to wrestle with that, right? And so any Truth Commission that emerges within the US has specifically around race, you have to be able to understand, digest, and own the fact that we as a nation have never truly dealt with our original sins, if you will, as I mentioned, right? And so any formal process for truth telling in regard to the United States has to acknowledge those systemic issues and present remedies in a number of the areas that we'll briefly highlight today. A number of the individuals on the panelists represent a number of organizations that seek to remedy and right the historic wrongs and confront the historic wrongs, specifically around the criminal justice system, around education, around poverty, as well as traditional issues concerning health. And so for me, in many ways, when we talk about systemic racism, it's important for us to understand we're talking about the major parts within all of our institutions within the United States that are impacted by these original failures, this original dehumanization and discounting of those who are marginalized and oppressed, specifically those of color. And so I'm not going to hijack this as if it's my course. I'm going to turn it over now to those on the panel. And I really want this to be a discussion, and we can begin to talk about and work through specifically some of the local led work that's been going on. But I would be remiss if I did not mention the importance of the work that we're currently endeavoring to see fulfilled, and that is to establish the U.S. Truth and Racial Healing and Transformation Commission. As I mentioned earlier, I'm one of the founding leaders of the national movement to establish a U.S. Truth Commission. I see a few people who are familiar with the work and who've been major partners in this work, including Auntie Pentakainen and a number of others. Originally this work, again, was focused on, centering the American experience, right? So often, as you all could probably attest, being in the peace building community, a lot of the work that's being done globally centers around looking at and confronting peace abroad. But America has had a problem historically confronting racial injustices and the various systemic issues that have really laid the foundation for our society, specifically the treatment of people of Black and Brown backgrounds. And so in many ways, this movement of movements, as we call it, emerged, birthed out of this moment, this racial reckoning that we've been witnessing over the past 4 years, but even before then, this timeliness and this major, I call it two pandemics, right? In the midst of these two pandemics, COVID-19, as well as the ongoing pandemic of anti-Black racism, it in many ways created a perfect storm for America to begin to have a conversation and to deal with these issues. And based on that specific experience, the U.S. Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation movement emerged, and we began supporting legislation and working closely with Congresswoman Barbara Lee, as well as consulting with the White House and other congressional leaders to make sure that we are keeping the ball rolling and keeping the movement going, specifically regarding establishing a truth commission here in the U.S. Right? We see this as a unique moment for this administration to move beyond notions of American exceptionalism and own up to our need as a country to confront these issues if we're going to do anything for the rest of the world. And so with that, I lied, didn't I? I said I was going to turn it back over, but for real this time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists, and I'm going to begin to facilitate the discussion. I want to start off with Amber Green, activist out of Salisbury, Maryland. And we just have a basic question specifically regarding the practical work, right? We talk about the overall broad work of a U.S. Truth and Racial Healing Commission, right? This vast, large enterprise or organization or structure, right? But really, in many ways, the work of justice in racial healing is local. And there are practical experiences that you can't learn in a classroom that activists and practitioners such as yourself, things that have worked for you that I think the peace building community could benefit from understanding. And also we could benefit from just learning about some of those practical experiences and struggles that you have went through as you have sought to confront the legacy of racism within your community. So could you talk briefly about some of those practical perspectives and experiences?
Of course. I think one of the most important lessons that I learned in my work with the work that I'm doing here locally, and also being a proud transplant to the Eastern Shore. I'm a proud, former resident of the DMV area. I'm from Washington, D.C. It's very well known that I am from Washington, D.C. But in doing my work on the Eastern Shore, I had to have that realization that my experience growing up as a young Black girl in DC is extremely different from growing up as a young Black person on the Eastern Shore. And that is a hard realization to accept, because in that realization, there's also that reality check of realizing that even in my upbringing, I had a sort of privilege when it came to economics, and when it came to culture. Um, Here on the Eastern Shore, there is no space to celebrate culture, or on a higher level other than, from your church group here or from your youth group here. There isn't a lot of outlet to celebrate culture, especially Black culture. And plus, because of the years of oppression with the many different systems in our judicial system, in our healthcare system, in our mental health care system, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in first empowering our local community for them to believe that they actually have a say and a place in this larger conversation of oppression. And so when it comes to practical work, I think it definitely begins in accepting that lesson of knowing where you are and meeting the community where they are, and not saying that, oh, because this is what we're doing in DC or this is what we're doing in Baltimore, it's going to work here on the Eastern Shore. And so, one, accepting where we are, and then also just being very patient, because in the years of the activism that I've been doing on the Eastern Shore, it takes a lot of relationship building, and relationship building doesn't just stop in a 1 month, 3 month span. In order for us to do a lot of the things that we've accomplished in the past year, it took about 5, 6 years of relationship building. So it's very important, in order to think about the practical way of doing things, is being realistic in knowing where you are and who you're trying to serve.
Thank you so much, Amber. I'm going to ask you a quick follow-up. Most people may not be familiar with Maryland's Eastern Shore and about your specific work, but Amber is indeed being modest. She was featured in a segment on PBS NewsHour. Her work was profiled in addition to the work of James. She mentioned that for over 5 years, she had been working specifically around confronting racial violence within the Eastern Shore community of Salisbury. But Amber, could you briefly introduce the audience and provide them with background regarding this work that you've been able to receive national recognition for starting and supporting?
Yes. And I think the most important thing to share with that whole experience is, just to be real and transparent with those that are watching. I have yet to even watch the PBS special that I was featured on, simply because I think a lot of the work that is being celebrated is prematurely celebrated, because there's a lot that needs to get done on our Eastern Shore, and many in rural communities when it comes to systematic racism. To give a background outlook to our community, there has been a lot of racial discomfort in our area, but with discomfort, if once you feel it for a while, once you feel it for a long time, you get used to it. And we have a community, a Black community in our area that have became, in a way, used to oppression, to the point where they have developed a skill of surviving, rather than trying to, just thrive and get past a lot of the barriers that are in place. And being someone who came from Washington, D.C., who went to school at UMES, who had family members who are active in the community, but also just active in knowing how to use their voice, a lot of the issues that were happening in our community, for example, racism and bigotry and discrimination, not necessarily specifically on race, but on gender and sexuality in our schools, that really attracted me to wanting to provide a space for young people to have their voices heard, as well as seeing the economic inequality, and the housing inequality, and the job availability there's a lot of um, there's a lot of examples of oppression in our community, and a lot of the community state that, it's just the powers that be. It's the same big names that are in power. It's the same, family that's been controlling everything for some time. And when history is brought up and dug up, that's when we found out how really, these certain families or these certain, groups of people have held on to this power for so long to the fact that you can track it back to the first lynching that happened in the city of Salisbury, to the point where a whole Black community was eroded away because there wanted to be a highway built. So you can see the remnants of oppression in a lot of our systems. And the best way that I can say to give anybody an outlook on how the Eastern Shore is visit, but don't just visit in the summertime. Visit in the winter. See what's going on here. And like I say, when I work with college students, make the decision if you're going to be an asset or if you're going to be a leech. Because right now we have a lot of resources. We have limited resources, and we have different groups competing for these resources. And so it leaves a vulnerable population out there not getting access to the help and the resources that's available. So I hope that answered that question. If there's any more follow-up, or if anyone wants me to expand, just let me know.
Great. Thanks, Amber. And James, I promise you're next. I just wanted to ask Amber a quick follow-up. You did a great job of laying out the historic issues that was part of the work that was featured and profiled. You all made history as well within the state, as having supporting the first state-led, the state of Maryland, city-led, local truth commission and task force to really investigate and honor the victims of racial terror in your community. And you mentioned briefly some of the systemic issues that you mentioned date back to this specific episode. Could you lay out really quickly, before I turn over to James, some of those prevailing practical and tangible examples that we see within this Salisbury community, specifically regarding systemic racism, these outcomes that I previously mentioned? How do those outcomes manifest themselves today in Salisbury? You're muted.
We can see that in two major examples. We can see that in our criminal justice, how that works here. We can also see it in our housing. Specifically, when we're talking about criminal justice and we're looking at how crime and how it is addressed and how our communities are policed, we have definitely a relationship that needs to be worked on amongst our police and our community, and trust that needs to be built. But that trust and that relationship has been hindered well before I reached the Eastern Shore, where James reached the Eastern Shore. It's been something to the point that has been buried and not talked about for so long. When we're talking about something more tangible as far as housing, when the Black community, Georgetown, was eroded from our community, it wasn't just eroded, it was pretty much erased from the history books. A lot of people did not even know that this very fluent Black community with doctors, teachers, they are unaware that this community actually existed in Salisbury. And so when we look at the availability of housing, and we look at the lack of tenant rights and the lack of knowledge of tenant rights, that oppression starts from there. But when it comes to the history and making and connecting the dots, I would say the best person to really connect those dots would be James, who really could give you a background of like the history of what's going on in our community. And once you know the history, connecting the dots is pretty simple. But a lot of that history connection and diving deep and asking those questions that you don't really want to ask because they'll make you uncomfortable, that is something that I think James and with our partnership and working with doing this work in our community, that's where you really saw that connection to past and present.
Great, James. Amber, she's taking my job. James, go ahead, please.
Okay. Well, I don't know if you want me to give a background on the certain works that we've done here. Is that something you want?
Yes, definitely. That would be helpful.
Okay. I'm going to share my screen, and it'll be a very short presentation.
Sure.
Like very short. Okay. All right. Can everyone see that?
Yes.
All right. So, again, my name is James Yamakawa. I am the founder of the Waikamako Truth and Reconciliation Initiative. So going back to about 2016, we formed a group, a chapter of the Showing Up for Racial Justice movement, that national movement known as SURGE. One of our first events was with Phoenix Youth Project. We, Amber and I first met at planning for this. We did a Black Lives Matter protest in downtown Salisbury, and it was well attended and, like, definitely ruffled some feathers because there hadn't been one in Salisbury, but it was during the middle of a community event. And while we were there is when we first started talking about the history of the courthouse, and that we had heard that there had been a lynching there. And that's kind of where that relationship really started. Moving on, winter of 2016, we held our first vigil for Matthew Williams. Now, Matthew Williams was the young man lynched by a white mob of several thousand in Salisbury in December of 1931. After that, mostly through 2017, we were advised by local Black leaders to go after the Confederate winder marker on the courthouse lawn. Now, this sign here, this general is basically in charge of all the Confederate prisoner of war camps during the Civil War, and including the notorious Andersonville, where like tens of thousands of Union soldiers, including Black Union soldiers, were basically starved to death. So this man was a war criminal. And here we have this sign on the courthouse lawn, not a dozen feet from where Matthew Williams was lynched. So that's kind of, and this was put up during the civil rights era in the 60s. Now, during that effort, there was pushback. Local groups ranging from neo-Confederates to bloggers to some members of the 3%er movement, and a rather unhelpful county council. Basically, over the course of that year, we tried and failed to get that marker taken down. The following year, Amber and I actually did a soil collection through Equal Justice Initiative, that's pictured right here, and also took part in the making of a documentary about the effort to take the winder marker down. So that happened in 2017 and 2018. 2019, I formed the Waikamako Truth and Reconciliation Initiative, understanding the fact that the history of these lynchings, Garfield King in 1898, Matthew Williams in 1931, and the unknown victim shortly after Matthew Williams, needed to be focused on, because those kinds of topics, if you can talk about them, you can talk about anything. And they really break open the kind of armor of silence that pervades the white community in Salisbury about talking about these things. 2020, obviously, between COVID and the George Floyd uprisings, the county executive, Bob Culver, who had initially said that the winder sign would be removed over his dead body, decided, with some pressure from local business owners, to take the winder sign down. So that was a victory. It was the same year that the city of Salisbury agreed to form a task force to put up the lynching memorial, which now resides in downtown Salisbury. 2021 was mainly taken up with the event. It was called Silent No More. Cheryl Eiffel, president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, was present, as well as hundreds of attendees. And the sign now sits on the corner of the Division and Main Street in front of the courthouse. Yeah, there you go. Gonna stop sharing now. So yeah, that's just kind of a very brief, like overview of some of the work that's been done around the topic of specifically the racial terror lynchings in the area. And Dr. Charles?
Great. Thank you so much, James, for that background. I'm going to ask you a follow-up in 1 second, but I did want to turn it over, before I turn it over to Commissioner Fakunle, to Angela Waters Austin, specifically something that's important and a connection that I see between the work that you and Amber are doing. You specifically focus on working with youth. And a lot of the work, as a historian, when we talk about racial issues and division, unfortunately, a lot of work focuses on the Deep South, right? However, your organization, Angela, being in Michigan, is really centered around confronting something that I think is very important, promoting something that's very important, right? And a major distinction, specifically racial equity, and promoting racial equity amongst youth, but also centering the healing of the community, right? So this whole idea that we can do something to support and facilitate our own healing, right? And prioritizing that. And so, Angela, if you could briefly talk about your efforts and your work as one of the original individuals and organizations to support the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation framework beginning in 2016.
Sure. Yes. Thank you, Charles, Dr. Davis. Not sure how you prefer, Chavis, how you prefer. But yeah, so I am based in Lansing, Michigan, which is our state capital, and TRHT of Metro Lansing is one of 4 communities in Michigan that was selected or invited to apply for a Kellogg grant for the Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation process. And out of 14 places in the country, none are alike. Of the 4 that are in Michigan, none are alike. And that really, I think, what was resonating with me with Amber is the local context, and that local context and culture. It should drive the process. And so one of our caveats to even saying yes that we would lead this for our community, because the request came from the mayor, because we were one of the organizations in Lansing that has been convening and organizing around racial equity for the past decade. We're transplants in Lansing. I'm from Detroit, born and raised in Detroit. So, my context of Michigan was in Detroit. And once you leave Detroit, you realize that Detroit is really unique, and that the rest of the state of Michigan is predominantly white, and that power looks different. In Detroit, I grew up with people in every level of the economic and intellectual and cultural spectrum, and the rest of Michigan is really different. So building TRHT in Michigan and in Lansing in particular, in the shadow of the state capitol, highly political environment. And so that's one of the things that I just really want to name is so much of this work has become politicized. The idea of racial equity, the idea of racism, the idea that anti-Blackness is a human rights issue is one that I think we, in particular in this group, and those who are listening, that really elevating that this is really a human rights issue. And so for our community, it was really honoring the grassroots work. So that's what I saw in James' presentation, is that it is people who are directly impacted, people who on a daily basis are living with the results of a system or systems, because all of them, you look across, the results in every system reveal that anti-Blackness still exists. So whether you're talking education, whether you're talking health, whether you're talking law, so we've taken deep dives in education and law in particular in Lansing, and the data just, we know anecdotally what yes, Kisa in the chat, food systems, absolutely, reproductive health, you name it. And so seeing Black people continue to be on the bottom of every system is why we chose, and we've been adamant that TRHT work has to be driven by people who are directly impacted. And so for us, youth being one of the most vulnerable populations, a non-voting population, a population that depends on adults to get it right for them, that's why we center youth in our work and why we are driven by their needs and their priorities. And we do that through youth assemblies, through our youth leadership program. We just wrapped up Freedom Summer, which is our organizing school. This is our second summer having done that, making the transition from, on the ground work, like hands-on, to an online COVID environment. We were only able to make that adjustment successfully because we brought youth in to work with us, to teach us about what that space needed to look like. And also to really understand what young people are experiencing and how the events of the last summer, I call them events, how a global uprising actually impact their lives, how COVID impacts their lives, the ability to access truth and actual valid information. Like all of these things that we're hearing from young people drive the way that we move in this process. And we really have had some deep discussions about, does healing happen before transformation? Can people heal with systems continuing to be violent? And the violence that you experience just going to the doctor, the violence you experience when you have an encounter with law enforcement, the violence you experience even in the classroom. So, those experiences from young people really drive the policies and the systems transformation work that we do with adults, because the youth organizing is one piece of it, but it drives the work that we do with our systems leaders. So, taking a deep dive with our prosecutor over the past few years, and now seeing the data that shows at every step of the process, from the investigation to the charging, that it is very clearly anti-Black. It is very clearly biased. And to actually be working with a systems leader through the relationships, because that's also what I heard, is the importance of building relationships, not just with the community, because we're accountable. One Love Global is accountable to our youth. We're accountable to the Black folks that we serve. And ultimately, it is the systems leaders who have the resources and the funding who should be accountable. So we have to do the work of accountability, but organizing our communities, building that power, all of that work is healing. So the cultural part, the food piece, even coming back to the food, even the way that we organize ourselves around food and how food is so much a part of our culture and our gathering and our convening, that we are responsible for holding the healing process, because it is a process. And we cannot tell people to wait to heal until the policies change, but we actually have to do the work in organizing to encompass healing as a part of the journey. That healing is a part of actually taking action. Every time we protest, every time we text, every time we tweet, all of that can be healing, and also paying attention to the need for caring for ourselves and caring for our community, because it is a major heavy lift. And we bring that violence, unfortunately, into our bodies and into our homes. So the healing part of it is so much bigger than I had fully appreciated coming into the work. I came into the work with a data and a policy orientation, and 5 years later, or almost 5 years later, we are investing heavily in the healing work with our youth, with our teachers, with our faith community, and exploring what accountability through a healing circle process might look like. What does it look like to hold the person who's harmed, the people who are harmed through that process? And what does it actually look like to hold people who get invited into accountability? Right now, we have people who are feeling like every time you say racial equity, that they're under attack. Every time we talk about anti-Blackness, that it's an indictment of white people. Clearly, we have to be able to envision a world where everybody gets healed and recognize that white supremacy, the delusion of white supremacy, the false belief in a hierarchy of human value actually hurts everyone. And that's why people don't want to reckon with the harm that's been caused, because it means that they have work to do. And this is it's a journey, it's a process. And we actually have to have spaces to hold people who have caused harm. And so that whole conversation about transformative justice has to include the perpetrator as well as those who've been harmed. And that's a hard reality to hold on to as a Black woman.
Thank you so much, Angela. Something that you spoke to specifically is the role of truth telling, but also I think what really makes the TRHT framework so unique, right? And uniquely catered and designed for the US perspective, which is one of the reasons why, as a scholar and a practitioner, I really leaned on and leaned to this perspective, because I saw how it incorporated not only the lessons learned from this TRC in South Africa, specifically around the importance of truth telling, but also the ways in which racial healing is prioritized, as well as the transformation piece. So I see them as being equally as important and all a part of the 3 steps necessary in the US, so that we can see actual systemic change, because that's what this is about, right? It's no longer about apologies or remedies that only temporarily fix issues. That is something that America has become really good at historically, but we've always failed at the end to confront the systems that continue to allow these things to perpetuate. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm so appreciative of Dr. Gail Christopher's framework and her developing this. One of the major pieces that really speak to me is this narrative change, the first phase, the narrative change or truth-telling phase. And this is where I'm going to turn over to Dr. David Fakunle, who is a mental health practitioner and also one of the newest leaders of the National Black Storytellers Association. He incorporates narrative and storytelling within his work, specifically around historical trauma and confronting and supporting community suffering from mental health issues. And so, David, if you could briefly talk about the importance of narrative change as well as racial healing within this process and this work. And then I'll turn it over I'll ask you another question about the State Commission before we take questions from the audience.
Got you. Thank you, Charles. Appreciate being here. So, narrative is at the core of our understanding of the world. We hear these adages, these proverbs all the time about how history is written by the victor. It's totally true. And the result of that is that so many other perspectives on how this world has operated are lost because we don't care about the losers. And there's been a suffering because of that, especially in the context of U.S. history, Maryland history, Baltimore history, however specific you want to get it. So what our commission is doing for the state of Maryland is reclaiming the importance and the value and the impact of a lost narrative. If not for people like Charles, like Linda Dyer, peace be upon her, so much of these stories would have been lost to time. And there are so many understandings and so much clarity that we wouldn't have if not for those who kept the history. That's what storytelling is. That's what storytellers do. So the griots of Africa, they maintain the history, the knowledge, the culture, the traditions, the practices, so that it was never lost to time. There's always going to be evolution. There's always going to be change because change is inevitable. But there's still a commonality with some of, or a lot of what we've experienced throughout history, especially if we're looking at the definition of being black in this country. No matter whether it's the 1700s, the 1800s, the 1900s, and now the 2000s, there are commonalities with what that experience means and what that experience feels like to be black in this country. And we can make it specific to being black in the state of Maryland. So our commission is helping to connect the dots. It's helping to assure that the current generations that are with us and the future generations to come understand the totality of what racial terror and racial oppression has looked like. At the same time, it's about understanding and appreciating what racial healing can look like. And for me, at the foundation of that is giving people the space, the comfort, the power to tell their story. To share their unapologetic truth is one of the most revolutionary things that you can do. So when we look at how history has been written, I think those who have told the stories and have written the stories realize what letting those other perspectives come to the surface can do. So transitioning to the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it is about capturing the history. It's about finding more history that we can with our abilities, but it's also understanding the present and letting those who have dealt with the legacy of racial terror lynchings tell their story of what that terror has looked like. So perhaps they don't have to worry about having a noose around their neck. Perhaps they don't have to worry about being mutilated. They don't have to be worry about being burned in public spaces. But there are other forms of terror that they do have to worry about on a consistent basis. We heard about it. We heard about access to food. We heard about housing. We heard about wealth distribution. The list goes on and on and on and on. It manifests in so many other ways that are just as devastating, if not more devastating, than a lynching could ever be. So for people to understand what they experienced last year and what they may continue to experience moving forward, we must connect the dots. And that is one of the biggest goals that we can achieve as a commission, and also to set the framework for how healing and justice really looks in this country and in this state at this time.
Great. Thank you so much, David. I wanted to ask you one quick question, and I wanted you to provide specifically the audience with context surrounding your work as the chair of the first commission to really confront racial terror and racial violence within the state, right? And so we've talked with a number of the local leaders like Amber James and Angela who are doing this work locally, but what does it mean to be tasked and to be leading a state commission that is taking this the lead in many ways from the local-led efforts to provide remedies in a form or semblance of justice, a roadmap to justice for communities in the state of Maryland who continue to suffer as a result of these systemic issues?
So I will be completely honest with everyone out there. When I became the interim chair of the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission, it was because I was the only one who raised their hand. So as you can imagine, no one was clamoring at the bit to take this gig on. But I started to get the butterflies in my stomach. I started to get the nudges from people beside me, and I said, okay, I'm going to do it. I rarely have put myself out there in such a position of leadership. Wasn't even thinking about the ramifications or just I guess for lack of a better word, how heavy it was to be in that position. I just raised my hand. and so I've been learning as I've gone this entire time. That's why I'm grateful to Charles. I'm grateful to our council. I'm grateful to all the other commissioners who have helped guide me as I've been the quote-unquote official guide of this commission. I will say that a lot of my life has led up to this moment with everything that I've learned thanks to the National Great Blacks and Wax Museum. So I knew what it meant to be black in this country, even as a child. I got introduced to racial terror lynching as a teenager. So I say that I processed my emotions a long time ago, and now I can really look at making sure this doesn't happen anymore, and to make sure that the damage that has happened because of racial terrorism is repaired. So I'm grateful. I think one of my friends put it best. This is probably the most important thing I'll ever do in my life. I'm okay with that. That means maybe I can retire early. Who knows? It's such a moment for truth. It's such a moment for healing, and not just around this commission, but Charles, you talked about it with storytelling. The way that people are looking towards storytelling to understand what the hell's going on in our world is because of the moment that we're in. You talk about two pandemics. We're dealing with the pandemic of COVID-19. We're dealing with the pandemic of systemic racism. And they're converging in so many ways. And there are just certain things that we can't understand any other way than to listen to each other's stories and to tell our stories. So as someone who was blessed to learn from a griot one of the greatest griots ever known in Mary Carter Smith as a child, having those seeds planted from a cultural institution like the National Great Blacks and Wax Museum, for it to lead up to this moment where I take both of those foundations of skills and knowledge towards real change on a state level, a local level, because I love my Baltimore, y'all know that, and a national level. It's incredible, man. That's all I can say, and I'm grateful for this ride.
Wow. Thank you so much, David. Again, David is quite modest as well. So the commission actually received a grant from the Department of Justice for $300,000 to investigate.
Under the previous administration, mind you.
Exactly.
Take that for what you will.
Yes, under the previous administration, to actually investigate these cases, the over 33 at this time current cases that we have identified in the state of Maryland. And with those funds, we're able to actually hold the hearings. So indeed, the governor, as David could tell you, signed the bill, but there was no funding to support this commission. And so we have leaned on not only the local support, but we're also thankful for the funds that we've received from the DOJ to be able to hold these hearings. The first hearing will take place, which is the nation's first hearing on racial terror lynching in the history of the U.S. as far as we know it. This will be taking place on October 2nd in Allegheny County, where we'll be holding a TRC-style hearing with relatives, descendants of victims, as well as perpetrators in Allegheny County, Maryland. David, before I turn it over to the audience, if you could just quickly talk about the importance of understanding, as you represent a state body, allowing the local-led leaders and movements to lead these efforts as an entity of the state.
It's a reallocation of power, and I'm totally for it. This work is not easy. Charles, as I know you know. James, as I know you know. Amber, as I know you know. Angela, as I know you know. It's not easy. I believe in working smart, not hard. I don't like working hard. So it's not just beneficial to me, to us as a commission, but it's beneficial to liberation, quite honestly, to say this will not work without the people. This will not work without the local coalition. This will not work without the local historians. This will not work with the local keepers of the culture. So the hearings or community sessions, we keep going back and forth with what we want to call it. But these spaces that we will create in the different regions of Maryland will be attuned to the different regions of Maryland. So Lower Eastern Shore will not look like Western Maryland. Baltimore County is not going to look like Prince George's County. Montgomery County is not going to look like Southern Maryland. It's not supposed to. I've lived in this state my entire life. I've been to many parts of the state, and there's so many more that I need to see. It all looks different. Okay, Western Maryland ain't Baltimore City, and that's fine. The way to make this relevant, the way for this history and for this charge for justice, for healing, for truth, will only work if it reflects the context of the people who we're trying to impact. Point blank, period. The message is going to be the same no matter where we go. But how that message is delivered, whether it's the words, whether it's the practices, whether it's the traditions, will be attuned to the people of that space, with the goal of, if you feel that this history is an injustice to humanity, there is something that you can do about it. If you think what you're seeing today is an injustice to humanity, there's something that you can do about it. We as this state body will use our power that has been granted to us by the Maryland General Assembly, unanimously, I might add, to give that power to the people because they know the stories better than we do. Yes, we are researchers. Yes, we are historians. Yes, we are those who are committed to this particular story. But there are certain narratives that we just don't know, that need to be known, that need to be elevated and strengthened and supported and galvanized. That's the most powerful thing that we can do, is say that this commission is truly on behalf of the people and was designed by the people and was driven by the people. Because who are they And I'm speaking to the they in Annapolis and all across the state. Who are they to deny the people? We are simply a body of the people, for them, because of them.
Thank you so much, David. This time, I'm going to turn it back over to Theo so that we can begin to take some questions from the audience. So thank you all so much. And I'll table my question for whenever we've received some from the audience.
Can I actually, while we're getting the questions, it's
Sure,
something that Dr. How do you say his last name? I don't want to mess it up.
Fakunle.
I still mess it up. But we right here because there's something that you said that I think attests to what you were saying, Miss Austin, about that healing process. Because I definitely think the message is definitely going to be the real with each community as far as like in order for this change to happen, each community is going to heal. But as we see in our individual lives, the healing process is so very different to each individual. And so it's like what I see here locally, a lot of our peers, our allies from different counties, they talk about healing and they want to do these kumbaya meetings. They want to do these, let's talk about how you feel and is that right? All these different structures to hold a conversation. What doesn't reflect what our community want and needs is like our way of healing is getting immediate action to the injustice that we're facing today. And I think in order for us to, the work that me and James that we were doing here locally, we had to move past that idea of healing and just having a conversation and realizing that the only way that we were going to get young people to get involved into this conversation is if we met their immediate needs. You want us to say how someone being lynched in 1935 is relevant to me being shot up by a police officer in the city of Salisbury Park. Tell me how that's relevant. Like, I need immediate change right now. And I think it goes into what you're saying, that every community is going to be different. Every community needs to heal, but I think we have to realize that healing looks different. And how a community heals one way is not going to be the same way that another community heals. And so with the work that I'm doing with the commission and this task force, the one thing that I want to do is holding accountable is knowing that, yes, we represent the people, but in order to represent the people, we also have to hold the powers that be accountable, because there is this notion that whatever we come up with as a commission is going to be a blanket Band-Aid solution for every community. And this work is going to be hard, and it's not going to be a simple Band-Aid. It's literally going to be, this person's going to need a Band-Aid, this person's going to need a sling, this person's going to need a whole new living facility in order for them to get back on their feet. And so when we're talking about holding the powers that be accountable, we also have to hold ourselves accountable and making sure that we're not taking the easy way out. We're not taking the easy route and trying to say, well, let's collaborate with this community, this community, and this community, and let's do what they're doing. We can't do that because each community is healing different. And Miss Austin, what you're doing in Michigan, I was on the website and I was looking. I'm amazed. I am so inspired. And I will be stalking you and emailing you pretty soon, because a lot of the work that you're doing in Michigan, I think that we could recreate and customize it to the work that needs to be done here on the Eastern Shore. Because what we're doing in Phoenix Youth Project is we center youth voices just as you do, and we work with the same age group. But I have to also realize that with the systematic oppression and a lot of all the different issues that we are facing here, I have to work with my youth a lot differently than you would work with your youth there. But the same plan of healing and having that conversation is just so dope. So I'm just glad to get inspired by you all. You guys are awesome.
Thank you so much, Amber. I want to go ahead. I think we have a Corinne Ryan. We have a question specifically. I'll do the best I can. Hopefully I can do justice to this. So they agree with the need for this human rights language. They cited UN High Commissioner mentioning the importance of being in solidarity and forcefully rebuking anti-Black violence, citing the murder of George Floyd as a turning point for humanity to confront this issue. They ask, would it be valuable to connect local truth-telling and transformation work to the global human rights struggle? And you all can take that one at a time. I'll go last unless others want to respond. Thank you, Corinne, for that question.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll start. Absolutely. And part of what I mentioned when talking about the commission, that's been one of the most enjoyable parts of it for me. Is as soon as we started to craft our story of the work we're doing, people from the truth, reconciliation, healing, restorative justice, you name it, they are it, connected with us and wanted to provide their expertise and, if nothing else, just their support of what we were looking to do. And Charles can attest. Now we're talking to the federal government. They're looking to us to do similar work around other issues of racial injustice in the United States. We knew how golden an opportunity we had with this commission, that it wasn't just about what we could do for the state of Maryland and perhaps our particular jurisdictions, but what we could do for this country and perhaps the world. And I am grateful above all else for those people, for those entities that have reached out to us, who have provided, again, their expertise, who have just provided their support. And the fact that people are paying attention. We wanted the attention. We did not want this to go under the radar. We want to be loud, obnoxious, but just clear and unapologetic about the work that we're doing. And it's not just about honoring the victims of those racial terror lynchings that we can research and verify, but to, again, connect the dots with how racial terrorism looks like in the United States today, in the state of Maryland today, and to lay the groundwork for what true healing and justice looks like. So not performative, not superficial, systemic. Because we are a group of people that know the deal. I'll just put it that way. We know the deal. We know how this works. So we know what the solutions need to look like, or at least where it needs to begin. So that's what we're going to do. And we want the world to pay attention to us and follow our lead.
Would anybody else like to respond as well, or I can go to the next question?
I'll just jump in and just say yes. My response is yes, and acknowledging the limitations of working in global human rights spaces, and what that actually means for anti-Blackness, which is global. So we're talking about anti-Blackness in the US, but I think elevating that conversation, whether it's about global reparations, whatever conversations we have about racial equity as a human rights issue in the global space, really has to look at anti-Blackness and colonialism, colonization, and what that means in a global conversation, which begins to change the conversation and who's involved in that conversation. So I would just say, and I'm like, this is a plug, so I'm just going to own it. So as the director of operations and policy for Black Lives Matter Grassroots, which is the global formation of chapters, for us locally, and I'll say this even as we have these conversations, that we're getting truth every day. Black Lives Matter was a truth that has been resisted and pushed back with All Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter and whatever else people thinks matters more than Black people. So I think that any conversation, any work that we do has to really elevate that grassroots work and support the people who are on the front lines. So if we have a conversation, or when we expand and have a more inclusive conversation about racial healing in a global context, that we have to remember that and also lift up that those conversations are happening before we get there.
Thank you so much, Angela. And I'll just extend on that as well. Well, I'll go to the next question, excuse me. We regarding the connection between the local and the national, specifically referencing Representative Lee's work. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the work of Breathe With Me Revolution, who is really sponsoring and supporting a lot of these efforts regarding the establishment of a U.S. Truth Commission. In our conversations prior to the administration, this administration, and to this day, their main question specifically is about what does it look like in terms of mapping this out? How does this look? What is this? How does the local connect to the national? What entities or organizations, institutions, existing frameworks within the U.S. Government can be utilized to make sure that the local is connected to the national, right? What we definitely do not need is another group of a large body of elites who are making decisions on behalf of the people. We need a locally driven movement, as well as a locally driven national commission that is informed and led by local leaders, if it's going to be successful. And so hopefully that'll answer your question there. One of the questions that Theo had presented. But we have another question here specifically regarding the healing piece that I briefly mentioned. It's a general question from Kashim Davis. How do we engage in self-healing and work towards economic, political empowerment? Great question. One at a time.
Hey, we're all trying to give space to the other person. We're being super polite, and I know we have limited time on that. Acknowledging that we've all experienced harm and that healing is necessary is probably the first part. Like you would think that people recognize that the issues that they face every day, from poverty to transportation to whatever, that people would connect it with racism, they do not. So having had a chance to get input from Black parents in particular, with young children in our community, access to childcare, transportation, low wages, but how is any of this connected to racism? And people say no. So there's even an education process and being prepared for people to actually arrive to the place where they can acknowledge harm and realizing what that actually does to a person emotionally, and how much support people actually need to even acknowledge the harm. And so lots of community supports, lots of spaces for people to connect with healing. And also I think entry points for people to access and to enter into healing in ways that actually are culturally rooted. So I mentioned food, music. I think engaging people in the process of even understanding how policy happens can actually be a fun journey. It doesn't have to look like a lecture. So I think the more that people get hands-on and actually feeling and stepping into their power, like that can be healing for people. Knowing that the small action that you're taking in your community is a step of self-healing. So as you're building towards that economic and political empowerment, just showing up at a meeting and feeling like you're connected to other people who care about the same issues can be healing and actually build towards that work. So for me, it's even being in this space for me is healing. That I get to talk about racism, that I get to talk about what a lie white supremacy is, for me is healing. And to be able to create spaces for other people to name these things, to name these truths, can be extremely healing. So, and I do have faith that that new power is necessary. Do I think the existing power structure will ever change their position? It's not necessary, because Amber is building new leaders to take those places. So I want to support Amber to make sure we get new leadership.
Exactly. I agree. I was going to respond to that second half as well. I think, we're asking the wrong question. I think in many ways, Kasim, they're answering the question in the first part where they talk about this importance of economic and political empowerment. If we focus on the youth and empowering them in these ways, then the notion of power is moot in many ways, right? If those, to your point, Angela, if those who the future, right, the youth, if we're preparing them to be leaders and and letting them lead and support these movements, then it's not so much about the structure. Systems, like I tell my students, systems and institutions really don't change until the people demand the change, and the environment is in many ways so uncomfortable that something has to change. And when we look at a lot of the things that we've seen change historically and most recently, but also throughout the larger Black freedom struggle across the globe, it is this agitation and this lack of comfort that institutions, this starving, if you will, within institutions, in which causes change to happen. And so in many ways, that type of environment has to be cultivated. Some scholars and activists will call this a social agitation, right? This agitation has to continue. And I think we can't get lost in being concerned about whether or not these institutions, having faith that they'll change. I mean, if they have no reason to, then they will not. But if the people demand it, then it will happen. And I think knowing that this movement is a movement of movements, which is very important. I say that, but making sure that we acknowledge that this movement to establish a truth commission is just that, a movement of movements made up of individual people, Black, white, and other, who all believe that these systemic issues and systemic anti-Blackness, that this major issue is causing harm to us all, right? If we're able to cultivate that collective and those voices, then we can be successful. I think there's one more question, I believe, specifically directed towards Angela regarding the work in Michigan. Or that was just a comment, I'm sorry.
I would like to add on to that last question. It's honestly, it's like one of those questions that has like a million answers to them, when it's like, do you have faith that the power structure will ever change their position considering anti-Blackness? And I think the answer to that question is it really doesn't matter. Just like Ms. Austin said, it doesn't matter if they will change their position, because when we look at our lanes and our roles in the social justice work, certain people have different lanes that they stay in. And for me, I personally believe that the youth have a very wide lane, and a lane that they can move around frantically in. They can make mistakes, they can move forward, they can continue to move forward, and in moving forward, they make mistakes, but they learn from their mistakes. But what messes up the process of actual change is that the generation above the young people are in this protective mode, and they want to protect the young people. They want to protect what they worked on for years prior, that they don't provide the space or really the resources for young people to keep moving forward and move forward in their failures and learn from their failures. And so one of the things I think someone had asked in the chat was, how can they get young people, particularly that age group 14 to 21, engaged in political action and advocacy work? One thing that I would advise is something that we do here at Phoenix Youth Project, is we have to be okay with them messing up and not getting it right. We have to be completely okay with them coming up with a solution, and that solution only just feeds to the emotion right now. Like, if they want to be in the streets and they want to protest, they want to yell, they want to disrupt the norm of the community, we have to provide them that space, that knowledge of how to do it effectively, but let them tend to that emotion. but come in on the back end and give them, the resources to move forward. You can't just stay in that angry or that emotional state. There's things you have to move on. And so with working with young people, they have to be involved in all of the aspects. They have to be involved in the development, in the execution, in the implementing. They have to be involved. It has to be truly youth led for them to be actively engaged. And once you create this youth led environment, you also have to empower them to say, you know what, you can go to a county council meeting. I tell young people all the time, after I've just marched with them, was on the side of the street holding protest signs, yelling, just doing what they were doing, the very next day or in the same group chat, I'm saying, okay, so make sure you're at the county council meeting. Make sure you're at the city council meeting at this time. Give them the tools that they need to make that lasting impact. Because right now, the great thing about young people is that they are in tune with their emotions. They are in tune with, the anger, the upset, and that's the fire that we really need to get things going. So I see a lot of our older generation kind of simmer that fire because it's dangerous, because you don't know where it's going to go. You can't control it. I don't want to control it. I want the young people to be mad, get upset, make the noise, but I want to support them and say, after you make your noise, go to this county council meeting and do the step by step. And so in order to, the powers that, I don't care if they don't change. I don't care if they don't change their view. What I do care is that I get a lot more younger individuals to get into voting, change our local ecosystem of, who's in politics, who's in office, like change the things that matter, rather than saying, you know what, it's the powers that be, and they're going to be that way. No, they're not. You control that more than what you think. So that would be my tidbit, and like my answer to, I think it was Mercedes, who has a nonprofit in Milwaukee. That would be my advice: is make it youth led, and provide that space that where they can mess up. It's okay.
Yes, and one of the questions that we had was about the ways in which you can support this work. And so I'll briefly plug the efforts in Salisbury that are going on, specifically what's being called tentatively the Not Just Tulsa movement, to really support the existing community of the Black community of Salisbury that is still to this day dealing with the legacies of racial violence and racial terror. There's a movement that's being led by Breathe With Me Revolution and supported by Humanity United to support the local efforts that James and Amber, the work that they're doing in Salisbury. And I added the link there to the actual Breathe With Me Revolution website, but you can also find more information about the work that James and Amber are doing. They sent those links out as well, but be on the lookout for more information about the Not Just Tulsa movement, specifically highlighting the importance of recognizing that Tulsa is one of hundreds examples of the ways in which communities were demolished and destroyed, and the ways in which these systems continue to affect these communities. These are real issues that have yet to be addressed, and we're beyond, to Amber's point, these symbolic gestures of reconciliation. There has to be conversations around justice and repair. And with that, we have 316, just trying to be mindful of time. We had an anonymous question specifically regarding narrative change. And so with that, we can take this last question and then I'll pass it back over to Theo to close this out. And so narrative change requires a holistic perspective on the historical events with the push-pull factors that influence a specific context. In 2021, the holistic perspective requires addressing events that happen at a different point in time, including intergenerational trauma. How is the Truth Commission in the United States doing justice to such a holistic perspective? With that, I'm just going to pose this to David, because David, in being the leader of the U.S. Truth Commission, specifically a commission that has adopted Dr. Gail Christopher's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation framework, I'll turn over to David to allow him to answer that.
I missed my internet cut out a little bit of during that question. Could you share that again with me, Charles?
The question, how is the Truth Commission in the United States doing justice to such a holistic perspective? Yeah.
Well, I'll say speaking for our commission, that's where, again, the context of the local coalitions and the local supporters of this work come in. Because we have our commitment to healing and justice above all. So yes, we're called a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Don't let the reconciliation part fool you. We're not really trying to reconcile anything. There's nothing to reconcile. We do believe in the truth, absolutely. So the foundation of what we're doing is the truth about racial terror lynchings that happened in the state of Maryland. What we would like to add to our title instead of reconciliation is healing and justice. So first and foremost, we want to do our best to either begin or continue, because we don't want to insult those who have been doing this work before us as a commission, continue the healing for those families that deal with the legacy of racial terror lynching, particularly if their ancestor was a victim of racial terror lynching. We know that there's a lot that they may not have been able to say, there's a lot that they may not have been able to do, and with the power that we've been granted with as a commission, we want to promote that and encourage that as much as possible. If we can be a space of healing for those families and communities that have been affected most by racial terror lynchings, then perhaps we can move on to justice, because we can now think about those solutions that address the totality of what lynchings did from a symbolism standpoint, because that part is important, but that's not the only thing to a racial terror lynching. The symbolism of a racial terror lynching, the economic damage of racial terror lynchings, the psychological, emotional, spiritual damage of racial terror lynchings, even the logistical damage when we talk about black towns and black communities that were completely wiped off the face of the earth as a part of this larger act of terrorism, then that's going to atone or begin to atone for all of these sins that have been committed without accountability, without any symbolism of justice or remorse for what was done. So to me, the holistic nature of our work as a state commission and what I would want the national commission to do is to look at the totality of the damage that has been done by racial terrorism, and then look at the solutions to be as total, as whole, as all-encompassing as the damage was, because that's the point. It wasn't just the person who was hung, who was mutilated, who was burned. There was so much more that was taken away from that family, those communities, and the state at large because of these acts of terrorism.
Thank you, David. Would anybody else like to respond as well? Amber, James, before I turn it over to Theo or Angela? All right.
I'll just add that something is coming up for me, and I won't name the country that made this ask of me, who had been through a truth and reconciliation process, and on the other side of it, the question is now what? Because people are really feeling injured and in some ways used, and that they are still living with the terror. The violence has not stopped. Apologies have happened. Truth has been named, and the reality of the conditions that people live in have not. And where choices were made to be in harmony and to be in unity, it has often been at the expense of the Black people who were harmed throughout history. And so the conditions of peace, and I wanted peace, have been again born on the backs of Black folks. So is doing this in the United States holistic? Is it justice? I think it can get us closer as long as we're actually asking the question of people who have been harmed. What does healing look like for you? What do you need? What does support look like for you? What is the outcome that you want to see at the end of whatever this process is that we are able to hold for as long as we're able to hold it? And it needs to look like that. And it's going to look different. So that's one of the things that we've been exploring over the past year of a racial equity accountability process, where people name it. Like, what does it mean for you? And can we hold that? And being honest about it in the same way that you've made mistakes and we hold space for that, are we able to give ourselves space for not getting it right the first time and continuing to course correct so that we don't end up after an entire process where people feel even more injured than when it began, so that we're building in those checkpoints and that we're assessing every step of the way. But that means having people who are directly impacted leading the work, which we just heard Dr. Fukunle, I hope I got that right, say, and that I think that resonates with all of us, is that people have to name, this is how I've been harmed, this is what healing looks like, this is what I require to be a part of your process, and can you deliver those things? And that's where we have to do our own assessment and really examine our capacity and realize the potential consequences of engaging people in this process.
Wow, thank you so much, Angela. I want to thank all the panelists as well, David, Amber, and James. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Theo to close us out. I just want to say thank you again to Alliance for Peace Building for hosting this and providing us with this space to share our work, our very important work that we're doing. Theo.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chavis, and thank you to the rest of you for such an engaging conversation. And I think you could tell that our audience were also engaged, asking a lot of questions, wanting to get involved. I think I mentioned this in the chat. This session, was being recorded, is recorded. And so the recording will be available on the Alliance for Peacebuilding website. We'll be sending it out to the participants. And so do look for that and do share it with friends and colleagues. And in the post-show page, we'll be sure to include the links and the resources that were mentioned on this at this webinar. So thank you everyone for joining. Thank you to our panelists for this excellent discussion. And so we'll see you next time. Our next webinar in the series is going to be next week, next Wednesday, September 15th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time on toxic polarization, and particularly exploring what we need to do in terms of intra-group work, particularly on the left, to address toxic polarization in this country. So thank you, everyone. Have a fantastic rest of your day, and we'll talk to you all later. Take care. Bye-bye.